Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum. I'm here today at Morphy's, the best place for collectible machine guns, and we're taking a look at a Mauser Schnellfeuer. This is the Mauser version of a fully automatic broom handle. They took their C96 and they added the switch to it. Now, a lot of people probably would expect that Mauser would be a leader, a forerunner in doing this. After all, it's their pistol. But in reality, Mauser was just about the last company to actually produce a full auto version of the broom handle. By the time they did this, they were running to try to keep up with a bunch of Spanish companies that were doing the same thing and selling guns pretty darn well, mainly in China. So the C96, of course, starts off as a semi-automatic pistol. It's really the first commercially successful semi-automatic pistol. It never got much in the way of military contracts because it is kind of bulky. It's a large gun. The magazine's mounted forward of the grip. It's kind of a bulky gun. It does have the detachable shoulder stock, which was a relatively common thing for pre-World War I, pre-World War II, mostly pre-World War I automatic pistols. But where this really takes off is in China, and something like half of all Mauser C96s ever actually produced went to China. During the warlord era in China, the C96 was a known, recognized pistol. The Chinese Imperial Army, before 1911, before the Qing dynasty fell apart, had actually purchased, adopted, used the C96, and so it was known and understood in China. And then after the Qing dynasty falls and the warlord period begins, this thing just becomes super popular with Chinese soldiers, officers, peasants, like generals, everybody. It's a big status symbol. I mean, it's a status symbol and it's a big gun, which makes it a better status symbol. It's colloquially known as the box cannon in China. And to get in on the success and the demand, Spanish companies like Bestigui Hermanos and Astra start manufacturing their own clones, essentially, of the C96. They're lookalikes. Actually, some of them are clones. Most of them are lookalike guns. And they start selling them into China in the 1920s. And the Spanish are pretty nimble about this, and they start adding features that the Chinese like. Things like detachable magazines, larger fixed mags, detachable mags, and then full auto features. By the late 1920s, there are Spanish fully automatic broom handle lookalikes being sold in China. And Mauser looks at this and basically goes, shoot, I guess we ought to do some of that. That's our thing, and they're selling our thing to the Chinese, and we're going to get left behind. So in 1930, Mauser develops a fully automatic version of the C96. It's a mechanism that's developed by Josef Nickl. He's one of Mauser's engineers. He would be the guy behind the CZ24 pistols, as well as a bunch of other developmental work he did at Mauser. The problem is his design isn't actually all that great. They make some of them, the first batch of 1,000 that are produced, are shipped with two 20-round magazines each to China in May of 1931. But by 1932, Mauser has come up with a better system. This is a new full auto mechanism designed by a guy named Westinger, and he patents that in 1932 in Germany. Patents elsewhere around the world, like the US patent wasn't submitted until 36, or wasn't approved till 36. At any rate, he patents it in Germany in 1932, and Mauser switches over to producing his version. And that's what the vast majority of production would be, and that's what we have here. So let's take a closer look at it. Like the standard C96, the Schnellfeuer will fit neatly into its own shoulder stock. You can open the hatch there, pull the gun out. Got a little Mauser marking on the stock. And then you can, of course, slide the stock into the slot in the buttstock. And voila, you've got a submachine gun, sort of. Kind of an awkward one, but you've got your shoulder stock, select fire with this little switch on the side, and the shoulder stock really is almost essential in turning the Schnellfeuer into an actual controllable weapon. These are going to fire at a rate of somewhere between 800 and 1100 rounds per minute. It's really fast. This has a really high bore axis. Like, you can complain about high bore axis on pistols today, but it's pretty darn rare that any of them can hold a candle to a C96. This gets really jumpy really fast. In fact, the legend is that the Chinese would always shoot them like gangster style here, held sideways so that the kick would spread the fire in a horizontal arc instead of a vertical one. I don't know that makes it slightly less totally ineffective. I'm not sure it's really, like, it's not something you should aim for. It's better than the alternative if you really have no practice on the gun. At any rate, we have a magazine release button here on the side of the magazine well. This is a 10-round magazine. They also made 20-rounders, nothing larger than that though. With a 10-round magazine, the mag is flush and it will fit in the shoulder stock. With a 20-round magazine, it will not. Now there were some Mausers made with fixed 20-round mags and specialized stocks made for them. The Spanish did the same thing. They had some stocks that were a little more cutaway that you could put a 20-round mag in while the gun's in the stock. But in general, 10-round fits in the stock, 20 doesn't. Now, this particular example is chambered for 9mm parabellum, which is very rare. The vast majority of these were manufactured in 7.63 Mauser, and I think it's important to point out that in the 1930s, 9mm parabellum was not the be-all, end-all ubiquitous cartridge that it is today. Yes, there were certainly some countries, a lot of countries, that were using 9mm. That was the cartridge of the Luger. And a few other guns, but of course, you know, the United States was using 45 ACP, the British had their own 455 cartridge, and the C96 was popular enough on the civilian market that 7.63 Mauser was not an uncommon cartridge. You also had other contenders like 7.65 Parabellum, the original Luger cartridge. Anyway, the point I'm getting at is 9mm 9x19 wasn't the obvious only choice that it would be today. So most of these are in 7.63 Mauser. This one you can tell is a parabellum mag, 9 parabellum mag, because it's got this spacer in the front. So the magazine well is left the same as the 7.63 caliber guns, and they just put a spacer in the magazine so it'll properly fit 9mm cartridges. The biggest visually distinctive feature designating this as a Schnellfeuer is this selector switch. So R is full auto, N is semi-auto. The original versions, the very first Nickl pattern Schnellfeuers, have just sort of an oblong, rectangular style switch between two fire positions. This sort of much larger oval switch with a spring-loaded button on it is distinctive to the Westinger, the main style of Mauser production, the second pattern that worked much better. Other than that, this gun is pretty much the same as a standard C96. We've got the same sight setting. This goes out to 500 meters. We've got the same sights themselves. You've got a fixed front sight out there. You can see a step in the barrel. That's something that was added later in C96 development. Hammer, of course. We've got our safety right there. One interesting element that was added to this was a sort of a bolt hold open. So on the original C96 with a fixed magazine, the bolt locks open on the magazine follower, and you can't take that out short of disassembling the gun, so that works as your bolt hold open. That locks the gun open, sits on the follower, you can put in a stripper clip, reload the gun, and when you pull the stripper clip out, the gun will close. That's not really feasible with a detachable mag, because the gun may lock open. In fact, you can see we have a follower tab right there. So the gun will lock open on this magazine, but you don't want it to slam shut when you take the magazine out, because you want to be able to reload the mag via stripper clip, since best case you probably only have 2 of these magazines. So what they did was bring back a feature that was actually on some of the very early C96s. Namely, we've got a little bit of a ledge back here on the hammer, and the hammer, the bolt, is actually being held open by the hammer. So if I pull this down, the bolt will close. And it doesn't recognize that the magazine's empty. It always works this way. However, if you're actually shooting and there's more force behind the bolt, it will snap shut. If I just rack this briskly, you can see that it closes. When the bolt slows down, only then does it not have enough force to overcome this little bump on the bolt. So essentially what happens is that the magazine stops the bolt going forward when it's empty. That then puts the hammer and bolt in this configuration, and when you take the magazine out, there's enough friction, because this isn't moving, that it can't overcome the hammer and close. Once you reload it with a clip, all you have to do is pull the hammer back a little bit, get a little bit of momentum, and it'll pop over that ledge. This also has the slight benefit of giving a little bit of resistance to the bolt cycling and slightly reducing the rate of fire. Not by a lot, but any little bit helps on a gun that shoots as fast and as generally uncontrollably as a C96 Schnellfeuer. For what it's worth, the Schnellfeuers do have their own serial number series, so this one's 79,000 and change. This is pretty close to the end of production. General C96s, you will see serial numbers all over the place, including down here. We don't have that on the Schnellfeuer, and they're not part of the standard C96 serial number run. Disassembly of a Schnellfeuer is essentially identical, at least the early steps, to a regular C96. So we'll make sure it's empty, and then we can close the bolt just by pulling down the hammer. There we go. Leave the hammer cocked. We're going to take this little tab, push it up, and there we go. And we can slide the magazine well off of all of the other bits. The C96 lock assembly is rather complicated. We'll go into details on this another time. There are a few extra bits in here to accommodate the full auto functionality of the gun. And if we take a look at the selector itself, what it's doing here is slightly moving the trigger. So when I pull the trigger, that little tab lifts up. That's the full auto position. That's the semi-auto position. So this just allows it to either activate or not activate the disconnector to force semi-auto fire. So a few differences. There are differences in the frame. There are also differences in the lock assembly on the Schnellfeuer. I don't believe there are any differences in the slide, the upper assembly. Production of the improved model of Mauser Schnellfeuer, and Schnellfeuer, by the way, just means rapid fire. So it's the Mauser Schnellfeuer Pistol, or Pistola, which is Mauser rapid fire pistol. You'll often see this referred to as a Model 712 in the United States, or you'll see it referred to that way. That's a designation that came out of the American Importers Catalog. That was Stoger at the time. They called it the 712. That wasn't really a formal German designation, but the name's pretty well stuck. So Schnellfeuer is valid. If you say Mauser 712, people are going to know what you're talking about. Anyway, they start producing these in 32. In total, some 98,000 of them were manufactured, the majority intended for China, and things went great until 1938. 38 is when they ended up ceasing production because in 1937, Japan escalates its intervention in China, its invasion of China, and up to that point, most of the European small arms going into China had been going by way of Japanese dealers. For a country like, for the Germans, for the Spanish, for anyone else who's trying to export pistols to China, there's a major linguistic, cultural hurdle to clear. Like, how do you find who to talk to? Who do you trust? How do you arrange payments? Like, you need some sort of middle agent who is going to be able to speak Chinese, have ready contact, know people in China, but also know people in Europe and be able to work with European trade agents. And a lot of this ended up being Japanese traders. So they had both the contacts to Europe and the contacts to Japan, and they were really good at facilitating this business. Well, that ends in 1937, essentially, when Japan's military intervention increases. Japan cuts off arms trade into China, for obvious reasons. And that basically ends Germany's Mauser's ability to ship pistols to China. So a bunch of their late 1937, 1938 manufacture, they were intending to send to China and they weren't able to actually deliver it. So they kind of just stuck it in the warehouse, and they ended up selling most of those pistols in the next year or two to elements of the German government. So of course, 38, 39, 1940, World War II is beginning, the Germans are starting to invade places, and you have agencies that are starting to look for small arms. And the C96 here was not a formal Wehrmacht weapon. We'll leave aside some of the C96 use by the formal German army in World War I, but by World War II, this wasn't in the Wehrmacht supply chain. And so organizations like the SS in particular, who had to source their own guns from outside the official military supply chain, they bought up a bunch of Schnellfeuers because Mauser had them in stock. Some were also apparently sold to the Luftwaffe for airfield defense or personal defense weapons. But that's where you end up seeing most of them in service in Europe, is with the SS and other elements of the Nazi government and quasi-governmental agencies, not so much with the Wehrmacht, but other elements of the German military machine. So production didn't restart after World War II. This really is pretty much an obsolete, I mean, it's totally an obsolete pistol by the time World War II breaks out. It's clunky, it's like, there are way better options for pistols out there. This kind of hung on mostly because of its desirability in China, which is more of a cultural thing than an objective thing. There were definitely better pistols accessible and available to the Chinese as well, but they really liked their broom handles, their box cannons, especially the full auto ones. So that's what kept this thing in production up until the late 1930s. Anyway, it was really cool of Morphy's to have this example, especially a 9mm Parabellum example, which we know about, what, 7 or 8 of these that are registered in the US. There's probably a few more that people aren't familiar with, like people don't recognize. There's probably about a dozen of these registered in the US, but that's not very many. The vast majority of these were in 7.63 Mauser. Anyway, very cool to get a chance to take a look at it here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.